Well, we're very excited that our internal coherence paper has been published in Nutrition and Dietetics, and today I'm really lucky to be joined by my co-authors Charlotte Rees and Dianne Reidlinger to talk about the paper. I'm going to throw to Di first and ask her about, what is this scientific approach and why has it dominated nutrition and dietetics research for so long, Di?
Yeah, that's right, Claire. Traditionally, nutrition and dietetics, we've sort of taken that scientific lens. And the scientific lens is where we're looking for that singular objective truth, looking for proof, looking for causation. And essentially, I think in nutrition and dietetics, we have for a long time seen the randomized controlled trial as being the sort of gold standard of research, which was predominantly developed for things like drug trials, which are far more simpler types of interventions. So when we're looking at sort of those scientific questions and applying them to nutrition and dietetics, we're looking at questions or research questions that ask things like, what is the relationship between saturated fat and cholesterol? What factors relate to cardiovascular disease and diet? Those types of questions are traditionally the ones that we seek to answer with that scientific lens. And it's for sure been fundamental to nutrition research. It's really helped us to understand those dietary risk factors across a range of chronic health diseases around the world.
Mm. And Di, what would you say are the limitations to that scientific lens when thinking about a broader variety of research questions in nutrition and dietetics?
Yeah, great question, Charlotte. Nutrition research or nutrition interventions just simply are not like drug trials. I sort of alluded to that when I was chatting to Claire just now in answer to her question about that scientific approach. We can't really treat nutrition interventions as simple interventions. It's a much more complex intervention. We're looking really at that intersection between human and social interaction, looking at some of those underlying structures within our society. So cultural influences on what we eat, geographical influences, the historical and social, environmental and physical factors all come into it. It's not just simply taking a pill. And I guess an appreciation of different research philosophies and paradigms. We're at that point with nutrition and dietetic research where we need to explore a broader range of those. So Claire, it'd be great to hear from you what other types of lenses or approaches in understanding research questions in nutrition and dietetics are there?
Well, the two main ones, and the ones that we talk about in our paper, is that of interpretivism and critical inquiry. And interpretivism is where we see knowledge as much more subjective and something that we develop through social interactions and through studying kind of society and what goes on in that real world. Interpretive approaches acknowledge individual experience and certainly privilege understanding through that experience. Critical inquiries really value knowledge as very cultural, and it really looks at trying to uncover structures and systems that perhaps are influencing the way things are. So typically it looks at geographical, historical, social, cultural, environmental, physical even factors in our community and in society that are actually helping us to understand something that we're studying in the research. It particularly looks at and privileges issues of power and privilege and marginalisation in critical approaches. And the most important part of critical approaches is that it aims to facilitate change and emancipate those that are being studied. And so these offer us very different philosophical paradigms to answer some of that complexity that you were talking about earlier. I guess, Charlotte, I'm keen to hear what this idea of internal coherence is and what are we talking about in our paper? What does it mean?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Oh, look, it's just such a simple and neat little concept, really. I mean, it's fundamentally about how, as a researcher, you've got to be aware of the philosophical assumptions underpinning your research, and that be the ontology, the epistemology, the axiology, and ensuring that those philosophical assumptions are aligned properly with your methodology and your method. And I was introduced to this concept by a great paper published by Stacey Carter and Miles Little, which we cite in our paper many, many years ago. I think they published it in 2007. So it's been, you know, it's not a new concept, as it were, but it's so important because it's that alignment that enables you as a researcher to produce the best data that you can for the research questions that you've got. And so for the researchers who are listening, it's really important that you get that internal coherence right at the get-go when you design your studies. But for those listeners who are peer reviewers and editors, it's really important that you throw an internal coherence lens on to the peer review process so that you're judging other people's work in a way that is internally coherent for their work. So not criticizing a paper from a different philosophical standpoint to the one that they're using. So that's really important. And I'll just give you a personal anecdote, and then I want to ask you a question, Claire. Because we know that sometimes reviewers and editors can actually encourage misalignment in work. And myself and colleagues, we wrote a paper and had a paper published quite recently. I won't name the journal, but the journal was very scientific in its orientation. It had very clear and rigid kind of rules around writing. So it liked to see writing in the third person, not the first person. But we'd written a qualitative piece, and like good qualitative researchers, we had our reflexivity section in there, which is all about placing yourself as a researcher in your research. And we argued quite hard, I thought, to use the first person, but we weren't allowed. So we caved in and we wrote it in the third person, which felt very odd, very awkward, and actually encouraged some misalignment or some internal non-coherence in our own paper. And so it happens. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask you, Claire, is, well, what else could reviewers and editors be doing to facilitate this concept of internal coherence through that peer review process?
Great question. I think one way is to potentially think about it as part of a checklist. So, you know, we have to tick off a whole range of different things if we're writing in particular different study designs. And if we had a question that actually asked about internal coherence, we might not see reviewers, editors asking, for example, about bias in sample in an interpretive approach that I see so often, or, you know, what's the power calculation for your interpretive study or your critical study when someone's coming into those things with a scientific lens, when indeed it is completely internally incoherent. So I think something like that would really help people and perhaps stop some of that publishing incoherence that we have actually seen, particularly in nutrition and dietetics research, and that we talk about in our paper.
Thank you.
So Di, is there anything else you'd like to add to the discussion today, given you're an editor of Nutrition and Dietetics?
Yeah, Claire, I guess the first thing I'd say is that I'd really encourage authors to look to use this paper when they're receiving reviewer comments and responding to reviewer comments. If there is a comment from a reviewer or an editor that you're feeling uncomfortable with, like the example Charlotte gave, where you're sort of being forced to act in a way that misaligns your paper, very much encourage you to look to our paper to rebut some of those comments, and you can cite that paper back to the reviewers and the editors. And I guess the final thing I'd like to say is that we've made this paper open access, which means that anyone can access this paper, and hopefully that will make it accessible to researchers, peer reviewers, and editors all around the world.
So hopefully everyone's found that useful. And yes, we hope you enjoy reading our paper.